Can Russia abandon Assad? The US Secretary of State is in Moscow with a message from Washington, back away from the Syrian president. But what's in it for Russia? And what is the West planning for a Syria without Assad? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. US President Donald Trump's inauguration was expected to usher in a new era of close ties with Russia. The past week, however, shows that's not happening. Harsh words have been traded over the Syrian conflict, and it started with a chemical attack in Idlib last week, blamed on a Russian-backed Assad regime, followed by the US strike on a Syrian airbase. Now, Rex Tillerson's visit to Moscow has done little to ease tensions. The US Secretary of State arrived in Russia on Wednesday, skipping a NATO summit to be there. Tillerson met with his Russian counterpart, Sergey Lavrov, to discuss the future of the Syrian president. The US wants Assad gone, but Russia wants to know what's America's real intentions there.
I will be frank that we have a lot of questions regarding very ambiguous as well as contradictory ideas on the whole plethora of bilateral and international agenda coming from Washington. And I would also like to say that apart from words, we also some very troubling actions regarding the attack on Syria.
Our meetings today come at an important moment in the relationship so that we can further clarify areas of common objectives, areas of common interest, even when our tactical approaches may be different, and to further clarify areas of sharp difference so that we can better understand why these differences exist and what the prospects for narrowing those differences may be. And I look forward to a very open, candid, frank exchange so that we can better define the U.S.-Russian relationship from this point forward.
Well, Tillerson's trip to Moscow follows the G7 meeting that took place in Italy this week. The foreign ministers attending spent considerable time discussing the crisis in Syria. They considered imposing new sanctions on Russia on top of the ones already in place from the US and the European Union. Now, that plan was rejected, but there was widespread condemnation of Russia's support for the Syrian government. And Tillerson said that Assad's reign was, and we quote, coming to an end. Now, Russia's ties to Syria date back decades. In the 1960s and 70s, Soviet leaders helped Syria develop its national industries, including the oil, agriculture and transportation sectors. Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz Assad, became Syria's president after a coup in 1970. He already had close military ties with the then Soviet Union after training as a pilot. So military cooperation between the two countries strengthened under his presidency. The Soviet Union established its naval base in Tartus in 1971, and for most of the years since, Moscow has provided Syria with military and economic aid. They've supported each other politically as well. Syria backed Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, and in 2012, Russia vetoed a UN resolution calling for Assad to step down. Well, let's bring in our guests. In London, Russian political analyst and former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov. In Washington, D.C., while al-Assad, he served as a senior Syria advisor to Samantha Power, the US ambassador to the United Nations under President Obama. And also in London, Ian Black, a visiting senior fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Inside Story. Alexander, can I just start with you? We'll bounce the question across. How does this fiery rhetoric that is playing out on the international stage sort of play out? Would you be expecting firm results from this meeting between Lavrov and Tillerson, or are this war of words just positions to be digested for the respective domestic audiences in the US and Russia?
Well, I think that this fiery rhetoric from both sides is primarily targeted at the domestic audiences. In America, the Trump administration is basically trying to convince the nation that it is no friend of Russia, that Putin has no influence over the president and his people, and that it is prepared to challenge Russia anywhere and at any time. In Russia, it's the same, because President Putin is in election mode. His re-election is coming. in March next year. He needs to be seen as tough. The stakes are very high in this respect because the Russian troops, Russian forces are in Syria. He can't just back down and walk away from that. So we are seeing this, in a sense, a spectacle in Moscow. Nobody is expecting any results from this meeting, but I must say that the fact alone that Tillerson did go to Moscow, even despite all this, rhetoric and accusations and threats and ultimatums, I think already shows that the dialogue is going on. I think Tillerson is a professional who knows Russia very well, and I think that the difference between the public rhetoric and what is happening behind the scenes, behind the closed doors, is completely different.
OK, let's bring in Wael al-Zayat in Washington, D.C. Is that how you see it, Wael?
Thanks for having me on the show. Not entirely too differently. However, I would say that my sense is that this administration, having come into office, believing they were going to continue to de-escalate tensions with Russia and perhaps focus solely on ISIL, I think something struck a chord with this last attack, with the president at least. It's clearly happened. We've seen it before our eyes. Now, will they match their outrage with an effective policy to get Russia to rein in Assad and basically de-escalate the situation on the ground, or let alone support a more genuine political dialogue? That remains to be seen, and I share my skepticism, actually, in terms of it leading somewhere.
Let's move over to Ian Black. I mean, Ian, you've been focused on the Middle East for many years, a respected journalist with the Guardian newspaper. You have perhaps a unique position in London, and as a European, looking to how the DC and Washington deal with Russia on an issue and an area of the world that you're very familiar with. With that first question, what's your impression of this meeting of Tillerson Lavrov?
My feeling is that everybody's confused because of the conflicting signals coming out of Washington. I mean, it really is confusing. There's so many different lines have been expressed by the Trump administration. And of course, the attack on the Syrian airbase the other day was completely out of kilter with anything that the Trump administration had said before. I agree that it's significant that Tillerson has gone to Moscow. My own feeling is that it is highly unlikely that there will be any change of any significance in terms of Russian support for President Bashar al-Assad. I just don't see it happening. The most I can see happening is possibly some agreement to restore the communication channel, the military channel that the Russians said they were cutting off after the American raid the other day, and maybe some determination common to both sides to fight ISIS. I would be astonished if the Russian side did anything to suggest that it was changing its support for Assad. So the only way that could change seems to... Yeah, sorry.
No, please, Ian, please finish.
Well, I mean, I think the only way that it could change would be if there was conclusive evidence that chemical weapons, and sarin in particular, were used in that attack. The Russians deny it. Not only do they deny it, they say that it was a false flag operation carried out by Syrian rebels trying to drag America into the war in Syria. If it could be demonstratively proven, conclusively proven that that was the case, that would put the Russians in a difficult position. Short of that, I don't see any prospect of them changing position at all.
Well, I have a supplementary question to add to what you're saying. Therefore, you think that perhaps Russia has no serious choices to make and that it's quite resolute in its thinking along the lines that it will continue to support Syria. In the wake of, could I say, gentlemen, on Wednesday, we are expecting the UN Security Council to be meeting, to be voting on an investigation which we expect Russia to veto, because what the rest of the Security Council want are the air records of the military jets, if there were any, flying in the sky, which would exonerate the Syrians and the Russians. So again, come back to you, Ian. There are really no red lines that Russia has to cross as such. It's resolute and that it will support Assad.
Unless there is some extraordinary smoking gun which implicates them. I mean, let's say, for argument's sake, that an investigation proved beyond doubt that the Syrians had carried out the chemical attack. Nobody has said in any definitive way that the Russians knew about that. They could possibly distance themselves from it. It also has to be remembered, let's recall that the Russians were part of the agreement to disarm Assad from his chemical arsenal back in September 2013, after the big attack in Ghouta, in which 1,400 people were killed. And by the way, worth remembering, at the time, Donald Trump was tweeting furiously that President Obama would be making a terrible mistake if he responded to that.
Yeah.
So that inconsistency in the American position seems to me we have to bear in mind all the time.
Sure. Alexander Nekrassov, we've just, in our introduction to this programme, we've given our viewers the chance to understand the very long relationship Russia has had with Syria, militarily and economically. And to pull away from Syria seems inconceivable at this moment in time. Is it at a stage where it has gone beyond the point of no return, that the alliances between these two countries are so strong they just can't be broken no matter what happens in Syria?
Well, it's the same as if Russia would suddenly say to America, why don't you cut your alliance with Saudi Arabia because of its involvement in Syria and other places and its support for some of the groups which we consider terrorists? Would you expect the Americans to say, okay, we'll walk away from the Saudis? Of course not. The same applies here. But I would like to say a few words about what would happen about the previous speaker saying, if this is proven and that is not proven. Excuse me, I've seen the footage. This footage, if you think this footage proves that it was a chemical attack, I'm sorry, it was a badly staged, managed exercise, and I find it pathetic that those people dare to use children to convince us that it was a chemical attack. That's the first point. Second
I don't think Ian was actually saying that. I think Ian was saying that we need a proper investigation. I think that's what Ian Black was saying in London.
I know. Yeah. That is what President Putin is saying and everybody else is saying. Secondly, with this so-called attack, missile attack, America's policy in Syria hasn't changed at all. How did it change anything apart from some of the groups of rebels suddenly attacking the positions of the government forces and several Russian soldiers dying because of that? I mean, this was a blatant exercise for domestic audience. The Trump administration warned the Russians and the Syrians basically in advance. If you look from the point of view of the military at that attack, it didn't achieve anything at all. Because half of these missiles didn't even reach the target. The airbase was operational within...
With the greatest of respect, Alexander, those are facts and figures that we're already very familiar with. So if we just continue with had this relationship, which is the main body of this particular debate. You're shaking your head, Wael. I'm not quite sure. Sorry, I want to bring Wael here because he's disagreeing with what you're saying. So please just come in so Alexander can hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, I'm pretty much disagreeing with everything I just heard. It's really outrageous what we're hearing here. After many, many years of undeniable evidence of the Syrian regime gassing and killing its people, particularly its civilian population, I was part of the effort to establish the Joint Investigative Mechanism, which is an international body that's set up under the auspices of the UN and the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of the Use of Chemical Weapons. And UN Security Council Resolution 2235, which passed with Russian support at the Security Council in 2015, in August 2015, established the mechanism to establish accountability and tell us who is responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And lo and behold, last summer, in its third and final report, the Joint Investigative Mechanism said that the Syrian Air Force has been responsible for the use of chemical weapons, particularly chlorine as a weapon, on at least 3 occasions in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And that also ISIL has been responsible for use on 1 occasion at least. So to sit here and hear, you know, our Russian colleagues still say that this is all done for political consumption, that this is somehow all lies to just overthrow the regime, these are facts established by credible international bodies that the Russians helped create.
OK, let's move over to then Ian Black, because you've heard what both sides there have just said, Ian, in London and Washington, D.C. And one wonders what the conversation will be in relation to what happened in Idlib over a week ago, when we talk about, or not we, when the Americans talk about common areas of discussion, common areas of agreement that they could have behind closed doors. We won't know what the results of those conversations are for a while. How fine a line is it from giving advice to Russia, vice versa, Russia giving advice to the United States, to giving an ultimatum?
I don't think that the Americans are in a position to give an ultimatum unless they're prepared to significantly change their policy on Syria. And we've heard zigzagging comments, we've heard contradictory statements from the president himself, from Tillerson, from the American ambassador to the UN about what their policy is towards Syria. It seems to me that the only way that the Americans can speak confidently, never mind give an ultimatum, is if there is some credible threat of greater involvement in the Syrian crisis. And I think the Russian calculation is that there is no such threat of a significant escalation of American involvement in the Syrian crisis. I just don't think there's any evidence for that. And, you know, even if I'm wrong and they're wrong, everybody works in situations like this on the basis of what is a reasonable assumption on the basis of the facts that we have so far. On the basis of the facts that we have so far, given the history of the Trump administration, and before that, the behavior of the Obama administration, I just don't see it. I see that the Americans will want to emphasize the need for a political solution to the crisis in Syria. The Russians are perfectly happy to use the same language. The problem with the diplomacy of the Syrian crisis from the very start, or at least from 2012, is that it fudged the central issue of Assad's future. There is no agreement on that, and everybody assumed it would have to be fudged. I don't see, despite the drama of the last few days and the rhetoric, that anything has fundamentally changed. Now, I can be wrong, and anybody who thinks that can be wrong as well, but you're going on the basis of what you know so far and the appetite for American involvement in this crisis. I think we'll see a continuation of the determination to fight ISIS, or whatever colorful language President Trump likes to use, to kick its ass or whatever. And I think the Russians will be happy to go along with that. A substantive change on the Assad regime in Syria, I do not see happening.
Alexander Nekrassov in London as well. Let's just bring in these comments by President Putin, who is accusing the US of planning more attacks. We've been hearing this line for the last 48 hours. Is it planning more attacks if another chemical attack is launched? Because the conventional weapons that are used in the Syria war and launched from aircraft continues. Syrians die every day. At what level and at what stage would the US come back in if they needed to, do you think?
Well, first of all, we don't know what's going to happen next. I think that President Putin and the Russians are saying that they don't understand why Assad and his regime are being accused of using chemical weapons, simply because it doesn't make sense for Assad to do it. I mean, if you use simple logic, he's winning the war on the ground, he's basically benefiting from the political dialogue. Okay, it's not going very well, but still it's going on. And then suddenly he uses, for some reason, these chemical weapons and basically sets up the Russians as well. It just doesn't make sense. So what we are seeing now, the rhetoric in Moscow, is, I would say, more of an election rhetoric, because there is an election campaign on already before the presidential elections. So Putin is looking tough, but he basically understands the situation. He knows he's in control of it. The American policy is not changing. I agree with that completely. There is no desire in America to send troops or to get involved in Syria. So I think we are just witnessing a sort of a brinkmanship, in a sense, with a bit of theatrics going on both in Washington and in Moscow.
OK, well then let's bring in Wael here, because while the military option may be off the table from either side for whatever reason, we're now looking at the legal sanctions side of what is going on. And just briefly, you know, sanctions on Russia have continued since they annexed Crimea in 2014, and we've seen that ongoing with travel bans, asset freezes, diplomatic restrictions. The talk of sanctions was made at this EU summit in the last 72 hours in Italy, with the UK wish that there should be more sanctions, and it was sort of declined, put off, you might say, by the EU, primarily by Germany. I mean, how does the US see sanctions as working? I mean, you've been in that position where Samantha Power, your boss at the UN, also talked about sanctions, getting them through the UN Security Council. What would be the position? What would your advice be to the Trump government at the moment in DC?
You know, if there was going to be any hope, in my opinion, to have our Russian friends rethink their strategy on Syria, it has to be part of a broader strategy, of which sanctions may play a role. But by itself, you know, the United States pursuing economic sanctions against Russia is generally not going to be sufficient. You need international sanctions. But even if you were to get the Europeans on board, as you mentioned, you really need the Germans, given their extensive economic ties with Russia. And I just don't see real effective sanctions being imposed by, you know, or agreed to by the Germans and plenty of other European countries. Hence the difficulty of having this tool by itself helping us achieve what we want. Now, I think if we're able to continue to credibly enforce some sort of a ceasefire in Syria, not continue, but begin through coercive diplomacy and the use of limited airstrikes, accompanied by serious negotiations, or at least an effort to restart political talks toward a genuine transition, coupled with even limited sanctions, I think then you start looking at the outlines of a real package here that both includes carrots in the term of the political process and sticks in term of sanctions and targeted strikes, especially whenever the regime really transgresses against its people and, you know, we see mass casualty attacks. I don't think you need to respond to everything the regime does. There's a way to signal, as we just did, and I'm supportive of what the president just did, to really let the Russians, the regime, and the Iranians also know that there's going to be a price to pay for certain actions on the part of the regime.
We'll just take a little pause there. I'll be coming to Ian Black in a moment, because I just want to give the viewers at home a little bit more. And like the sort of the current US government, President Barack Obama's administration also blamed Russia for causing suffering in Syria. Now, here's what the former US ambassador to the UN said last December.
To the Assad regime, Russia and Iran, your forces and proxies are carrying out these crimes. Your barrel bombs and mortars and airstrikes have allowed the militia in Aleppo to encircle tens of thousands of civilians in your ever-tightening noose. It is your noose. 3 member states of the UN contributing to a noose around civilians. It should shame you. Instead, by all appearances, it is emboldening you. You are plotting your next assault. Are you truly incapable of shame? Is there literally nothing that can shame you? Is there no act of barbarism against civilians, no execution of a child that gets under your skin, that just creeps you out a little bit?
Samantha Power, the former US ambassador to the UN Security Council. Ian Black, we've got less than maybe a minute to go, Ian. And just briefly, I want to talk about, with diplomacy really the only way forward, perhaps, in the not too distant future. We've got Federica Mogherini heading to Moscow on the 24th. Not just to discuss Syria, but Ukraine, Iraq and Libya. Russia's role in the Middle East is becoming more relevant, is it not?
Russia's role in the Middle East is a very big deal. The difficulty in dealing with it is you don't see the same determination, the readiness from the Americans or other Western countries to act with the same vigor and the steadfastness and the consistency that the Russians have. I think the whole story of the Syrian crisis, certainly the international aspect of that crisis, the greatest crisis of our times, let's not forget, is that the friends of President Assad, the Russians and the Iranians in particular, have been far more determined and far more supportive and far more consistent than the friends, allies of, however you define, the Syrian opposition. It's not that complicated. They've been strategic and determined about it, and everybody else has dithered and vacillated and been divided. And there came a point, I think probably in autumn 2015, where the Russians acted decisively, and the rest is history.
And there, Ian, we have to leave it. And for all of my guests, thank you very much for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. Alexander Nekrassov, Wael Al-Zayat and Ian Black. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can watch the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com, and for further discussion go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman and the whole team, thanks very much for your time and your company.